Well, good morning from St. Bart's in Midtown Manhattan. My name is Peter Thompson. I serve as the vicar here, and whether you're joining us here in person on Park Avenue or online at stbarts.org, it is a joy and a delight to welcome you to the forum, where each week we have sacred conversations about the things that matter. And it is a special joy and delight to welcome to the forum this morning our guest preacher at 11 a.m. and my friend, the Reverend Dr. Timothy Peoples. Tim and I were with Zach at Yale Divinity School together, so we're having a kind of Yale 2-week celebration. And he is now the senior pastor of Wilshire Baptist Church in Dallas, Texas. They are one of the flagship communities in the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship denomination, which basically means that though he's coming to us from a Baptist church in Texas, they're not Southern Baptists. So giving you that context. Tim recently received his Doctor of Ministry degree from Candler School of Theology at Emory University. Tim, it's really great to have you here.
Thank you. Oh, thank you all for having me. I'm just delighted to be with you. I stand up a good bit, so forgive me. I walk. Peter was asking, is it all right which way to say Baptist you are? And that's many of my congregants joke to say that we are the type of Baptists that say hello at the liquor store. So it is really, I'm grateful to be with you. And as Peter said, that I have finished my doctorate of ministry this past year at Candler. And so as I was thinking about what to do, what to talk about, Peter said, why don't you just kind of give your thesis? And I said, nobody wants to hear that, Peter. That is, 100 pages out in somebody's library that no one's going to read before. But I thought maybe it will be somewhat helpful as you welcome this Baptist into your pulpit. And so we'll get started a bit. On 2018, you all probably can't, I'll turn this side so it can be easier to see the slideshow. On 2018 of December, I was serving as the senior pastor of Emerywood Baptist Church in High Point, North Carolina. You may know High Point because if you look at any of your furniture, it has come from High Point as the furniture capital of the world. So High Point, North Carolina, every church I have served, I have always been their first black minister on staff. For this church, I was the first black senior pastor, with all of them retiring there. My predecessor, one of my predecessors was actually professor at Harvard Divinity and shared offices with Peter Gomes. So this church of much history and background that has with it. For a Baptist church, it was very different. The fact that from the beginning of inception in 1958, they did not have in their bylaws of the rebaptism if you came from a different denomination. In Southern Baptist churches, as you may know, if you come from Methodist or Episcopal or Presbyterian, you have to be dunked before you can join the church, but this church did not have that, and ordained women in the late 60s. So it became this church of beauty and progressiveness in the South, deep South of North Carolina. Well, this Sunday, my colleague and I, we preached a sermon, and we preached a sermon a bit about regarding immigrants, the migrant crisis, and the borders. And the border. And what was fascinating by what I thought was a very good sermon, we had multiple people that were very upset, and not because they disagreed with the scripture, which was fascinating. They didn't disagree with the homily itself. What it was that they felt as a black man and a young white woman getting up into this pulpit to tell them how they should be and act in the world. And so their perceptions of everything that they had upon us, I'm so sorry, everything that they had upon us dictated what they heard from the sermon. And so how does that work often in our churches, that when individuals, preachers, pastors, ministers get into the pulpit and they preach a sermon, what is it about our perceptions, our projections upon them that actually changes the sermon itself? The thesis is the perceived ethos and its effect on rhetoric and relationship. How do the hearers and audience's perception, assumptions of the preacher affect the reception of the preached word? This is a picture of Emerywood Baptist Church, a beautiful church I would say that when they decided that they wanted to build this place, they went to the other side of town because there was too many other folks moving where they were. The church, one of the head deacons gave them a few acres of land, and they built this church. And for 1958, the church cost, I believe it was $3 million. They raised that within 3 years to build the entire church, to be known as Country Club Drive, right on the side of that. And, it's beautiful, beautiful. I love that time. During my duration of the church, what was fascinating was that 43% of the congregants were not Baptists, but came in from other denominations and never planned to change the denominations they were from. They would say, I'm always Catholic, I'm always Methodist, I'm always Episcopal, I'm just joining this church because of the community. And I would often say that it's the church of the grandchildren and the grandparents. That we didn't have that middle ground of the parents to say, stop fighting with each other. It's just a different way of life and it's okay. So we had a large percentage of people 50 and under, and then 65 and up. And a decent-sized youth group for a church that got around about 200 a Sunday or so. Very white, as I said, on Country Club Drive, to move away from areas inside of High Point, North Carolina, is 53% black, 40% white, and the rest other. If you lived in this area, you would never know that there were any black people that lived in High Point, except me. And this one area controlled the entire city. So all of your city officials, all of the city council, all lived in this Emerywood neighborhood. And most of their children went to the private schools, but they were the ones on the school boards. So they never knew really what was going on in the public schools because their kids, so everything, the power was in this area. So here's the background of what we got with. Was with Aristotle's art of rhetoric. We know that those three pieces lead into all of the ways that relationship is built upon and how we understand one another. And it is the way that persuasion is achieved by the speaker's personal character. And when speech is so spoken as to make us think that him or her are credible. According to Aristotle, a lot of what we do as ministers, as preachers, as speakers, one is about what we say, and the other is how we live our lives. And if the two do not meet, there becomes chaos, there becomes problems. Not just within self, but in the people you are leading and working with, working alongside. So we first look at Aristotle that started that, and then Vanderbilt Divinity put on a thing from the Lilly Endowment in the late 90s, studying different congregations around America. And they sat with congregants and said, tell us how you best receive the sermon from your pastors over the years. It was about a 5-year study, and they put out these 4 different books: Lessons in Laity, Homiletical Case Studies, Believing in Preaching, and Hearing the Sermon. And what they came to understand was that more people would say, as long as whatever the person is saying aligns with my own beliefs already, I'm good. Right? I remember when graduating at YDS, and I believe it was Catherine Tanner. I can't remember which professor it was, and they said, go out into the world and don't tell anybody about what you learned because the church is going to hate it. Because they don't want their minds changed. They tell what we already know. And this was something that I had a lot with my congregation, that when saying different things or sharing ideas or different theological lessons, or even as we were working through our open and affirming process, I remember one man came to me and said, so you're telling me everything that my mother and father taught me was a lie? And I said, no, I'm just saying we now have more information to be able to share and to honor and to give. And as we know this, we evolve and we come better and we do better and we live better. And he said, so you're telling me everything my mother and father told me is a lie? So this is the background for the case study. So how did I go about doing this with my own congregation? We first did a survey. And in this survey, it was questions to really try to figure out where people were in our congregation, whether it was politics, whether it was cultural standings, their views on gender and race and money and economics and the state of America, but then also questions on the state of the church. Trying to get these understandings so that I can have a broad view, one, of the congregation that I have been leading for 5 years, and also, two, because it will help in knowing if the sermons we choose have that goes against their politics, goes against their culture, goes against the things they know. Will they react against that sermon, or will they be able to hear it and say, maybe I can look at this in a different way? The latter usually doesn't happen, let me tell you that already. So then we then had participant observation, and then the last thing was interviews. So again, as I got a little ahead of myself, what are the cultural biases and assumptions and perceptions of the audiences is what we're trying to get out of the study. How the audience will react to the sermons from various preachers, and how will the two data sets correlate with their response to the preacher's character and identity. So part of the survey, this was this introduction of me standing in another Episcopal church preaching, and giving this understanding of, I want them to just breathe as they take this survey. They're going to get questions that's going to get their blood pressure high. It's okay. It's anonymous. And I put in over and over, it really is anonymous. Like, I don't know who is doing this. And so in order to get my grouping of folks, I sent out an email of about 100 folks. I would say that, that's not true. About 57 folks. 30 of them agreed to participate in the study. And that was kind of a random pool of getting people out the congregation and just getting there. And then some of it was not random. I did make sure there was 4 or 5 people who I know that just do not like me as a pastor. So it's like I need to, don't want it to be fully biased. So we had 8 preachers, one of them being the Right Reverend Peter Thompson in that. But I've condensed this to 4 for today. And what we did on the first one was, after the survey, I found different sermons that I knew that would get some people's blood pressure high, and some people that were like, oh, this is good. This feels like home. I love it. And so the first thing we did was, from these individuals, take the sermon as a transcript and deleted every bit of the name so that they could not know who the preacher was. And so they had a, I'm blanking on the word, it's not, you check off? A Likert scale, there we go. Lord. From 0 to 10 on how they felt about the sermon, the responses from the sermon. Was there anything distracting or off-putting from the sermon? Was the sermon relevant to you? State why or why not. Was there things that was encouragement? And then other comments that you would like to have down in there. So they had these as written sermons. I waited about 3 months to get those sermons in so that they would not remember the sermon at all. Because they don't, I'm sure, like after I'm done at 11, y'all are not going to remember this tomorrow. So I waited 3 months, and then I had them in 2 separate groups watching the individual preach the sermon. But before I did that, let them watch it, I gave them an introduction of the preacher in a way that they may not have heard before, to see if knowing them deeper would change their realities of a Billy Graham. So take Billy Graham, for example. We are doing this in 2021, lots of discussion, 21, 22, lots of discussion on the autonomy of female bodies. And then in the introduction, which I didn't write, I had someone else write all of the introductions so that I wouldn't be biased. But in the introduction to say, also, Billy Graham really stood up and talked and stated about his affirmation of the autonomy of women's bodies and their right to choose. But to a lot of North Carolina Baptists who never heard that, it changes something, right? And, you know, Billy Graham's hometown was 30 minutes from, so I had to put Billy Graham in there. But what was fascinating is that if I keep talking about Billy, his sermon that most people read, I would say all except for 2, said this is the worst sermon I have ever read in my entire life. And when they watched the sermon, all except for those same 2, that I assumed, because that part was anonymous, said, this is the best sermon I've ever heard. You just can't get better than Billy. You can't, it's so good. Paula White, to know Paula White's background, is that she was started out as T.D. Jakes as her mentor and leader. And so Paula White preached up until 2012 into brown and black churches. She hoops, she hollers, you would think if you didn't see her face that it was a black church revival happening. But what happened in 2012? She became the lead faith advisor for Donald Trump. And so that flipped. And so now all her churches are predominantly white. So for these groups to listen to read a sermon and say, you know what, there's some good points there. That makes sense. And then to see her face and hear her background to say, it's really hard for me to take some of that. Or some others said, yeah, I know. Tim, can you preach more like that? No. And then there's William Barber, also a North Carolina native. People either loved or disliked it, the reading and the watching. It wasn't I would say there was a skew of more of liking it because of preaching of, in our churches, a lot on justice focused. I think the thing that surprised me the most was Nadia Boltz-Weber. The write-up of her sermon was beautiful. The crazy thing is, Nadia, and Lord, I hope don't get in trouble for saying this. I think many people think she's like, very, 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 very progressive because of her sleeves and all this. But when you read her work, or if you listen to her sermons, it is a very straight-lined sermon, gets to the point, sits down in 13 minutes, and everybody can go to the cafeteria and eat and be at home just fine. They're great. They're wonderful. They're theologically great sermons. I thought most people were going to have a lot of problems with Nadia because of her sleeves, her tattoos, and the look of who she is. And in all, except for 3 people, I believe, her written sermon and her watch sermon was the most loved out of all 8 pastors that preached. And so what does that tell us, right, as we know them? Because these are all kind of celebrity preachers. They're not individually knowing that we're going to sit down. What's your name? Roger. Me and Roger sit down, have coffee, get to know each other. It's a different relationship than me just giving a background of who this individual is and saying, here's something that you can know about them, and now you're going to hear them preach, and does that change your mind? For many of them, it did. But why does this matter? Being a black pastor in all white context, especially during 2020, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, my presence alone became a fear to my own congregation that had known me already for 3 years. That's not a long time, but they've known what I stood for. They know what I talk about. They knew the things that we do in community and life. And there came on Facebook a couple of members who used some very damaging and derogatory language. And I sent out a letter to the entire congregation. And I said, I love you all, but you cannot call me your pastor and the N-word in the same line. I love you all, and I think that we can do better, and I'll quote Malcolm X that repairing a wound or relieving a wound isn't just pulling the knife out 5 inches. It's not even just pulling it out fully. It is dressing the wound, caring for it, and making sure it doesn't happen again. Sounds nice. I had about 10 people leave the church because they said, there's no way you can tell me what I can call you. Right? I had people come to the deacons and say, Tim, all he's doing is preaching this Black Panther stuff. And the deacons looked at all my sermons as I write them out word for word, and they said, there's not one semblance of, we have no idea what you're talking about. And even if he was, what does it matter? And then that couple came to me and they said, you know what? It's really just you as a black man in the pulpit that makes us afraid of what's going to be said. And we just can't do it. And I said, I respect you for having just the courage to come and tell me that, to at least be honest about it instead of making up excuses like others. Why does this matter? This matters because when we become in closer relationship with each other, we learn deeply about each other. And so how we do faith together, how we lead together, how we walk hand in hand together, feet to faith, hands of hope together, matters by how we know each other. Right? So some of the good pieces of this, after doing this study with the church, again, part of it during the pandemic, I opened the sanctuary up and said, from this amount of time I'll be there, and you can come talk to me about anything you would like that's happening in the world today. I won't have all the answers. I can't speak for all black people. I can't speak for all marginalized and oppressed people, but I can be here. I can maybe even lend you a good book to read. And almost everyone that was in these surveys and this whole experiment came and sat down. And I remember one conversation where this guy said, I have my letter to go to another church if this conversation doesn't go well. And I said, all right, well, I'm just here to listen. And he said, I just don't understand. I don't get it. I'm 75. I'm really trying. I just don't know what to do. And we had a 2-hour conversation. And the next time I did a sermon on that was really heavy on race and immigration, that individual, he came up to me after this church and he said, I didn't walk out of your sermon this time, but I want to build better relationships so that we can talk about it instead of me getting mad and picking up and leaving. The Pew study suggests that out of 5 reasons why, top 5 reasons why people leave the church, it is because the pastor does not preach what I want to hear. This matters because even if it's not what we want to hear, the hope, the prayer is that there's some semblance of theological understanding working within that to make us better as a community together. And when we do this together, when we're in relationship together, it helps devolve some of those perceptions placed up on the individual preaching. Not to say that I'm all good and all great and wonderful. I have flaws just like each of us. But that's the beauty of the church. Of us working together, moving forward together. So that when we came to move in as an open and affirming church, one of my favorite congregants, Ron, stood up and said, I don't get it all, but I trust my pastor. And I know my pastor wouldn't lead me down the wrong road. We build trust in this relationship together. So I'll stop right there because I know I'm hitting on my 30 minutes that could go on longer of why this matters. And if you want more into the really deep theological, philosophical people of using Kant and all of those things that nobody usually wants to read, I'll be happy to give it to you.
Thank you so much, Tim. And we have plenty of time for questions. So if you're here in the room and you have questions for Tim, fill out one of those question cards and hand it to Natalie Johnson, who's collecting them. If you're joining us online, you can type your question into the live chat on YouTube, the comments on Facebook, or you can email me, pthompson@stbarts.org, pthompson @stbarts.org. Tim, as you were talking, I was thinking about, I don't know if this came into your study at all, but Phillips Brooks, an Episcopalian, not a Baptist,
yes,
who said that preaching was truth through personality.
Ooh.
And I'm wondering the role of personality, kind of implicit in your study, is that preachers can't leave their whole personhood at the door. In your case, it's very visible who you are to your congregation.
Right.
Your difference is very visible. To what extent did you reflect on, and what were your reflections on whether preachers should leave part of themselves behind so that God can come through? And to what extent does God come through the personhood of the person in the pulpit? Does that question make sense?
No, that makes very much sense. If I tell my congregants that God is within you and loves you and all of who you are, then that means that God is going to show up in all of who you are. And I think as ministers, we at times try our hardest to leave a great bit of ourselves at the door so that people don't recognize who we are. I remember one of my deacons who said in a meeting, if you have put Tim on this high pedestal and he does not live to your desires and your dreams and everything you've wanted, that is not his fault but yours. Because you have tried to turn him into this demigod and he is a human being just as you. I believe that there is a point where we do in the theological, spiritual act of moving out of the way so that we can hear how the Spirit is moving and working in our lives. So yes, on that end, I do believe that is so true. We have to get out of the way so that we can hear, see, and be more like Christ in this world. Because oftentimes, just wanting to be on Country Club Road changes how we act, how we believe, what we do, and even the way that we see God. And that's not just congregants, that's ministers too. I believe that personality of moving out the way to allow God to be more visible in our lives, but also realizing I'm not divine. I'm human and flawed too.
To what extent do politics belong in the pulpit? And I'm sure that your perspective on that probably differed from many of your parishioners' perspective on that question.
So so being at Wilshire is a very different aspect than being at Emerywood. I loved Emerywood; it was great. Wilshire is a very much social justice mission-minded church, and so we're down at the border discussing immigration. We are with our representatives and our senators. Talking often about policy change, change within schools, change within economics, all of these things. That is a big piece of who we are as a church, and sharing that from a stance that we believe in who we believe as a church, especially in Dallas, Texas. So you can imagine it's an anomaly for the church that we are. And so my predecessor, George Mason, he would often say, politics have always been part of the church. Jesus is a political figure, has always been a political figure. This brown Middle Eastern Jew going up against an empire. Jesus, just being who he is a political person. But what we don't have in the pulpit is partisanship. And so learning how to be able to speak to the congregation and to walk alongside a congregation and understanding that this is not about blue, red, purple, all the colors or all those things. This is about what is just and right and honorable. And part of politics is the work of citizenship in the world. And that's also the work of the church.
How did this project change you as a preacher? And also, how should it change those in the pews?
Yeah, there's a, I'm going to, so I don't miss it, there's a whole piece on how it changed me and part of that. Part of it was when I would preach at Emerywood, hot button issues. I learned how to do it better than just going out and saying it and leaving it there and letting them deal with it on their own. Learning how to walk with the congregation in the sermons, to be able to say, this is why we look at this. This is why we understand this scripture that goes with this and alongside of that. It also made me have a better relationship with my congregation. For me to understand where they are coming from, what their understanding is, and also misinformation from both of us, so that we could be able to talk. That same guy that I told you that came into the sanctuary, he and I, for I would say the next year and a half, we would have Scotch time every other Thursday on his porch. And he would have a hot button issue that he was ready to talk about. And he was like, all right, you get some time to talk, I get some time to talk, and then we're going to figure this out together. We're not going to change the world. We're probably not going to change each other, but we're at least going to have a conversation about it. And so that in itself, where we are in a place where people just won't have conversations with people who disagree or look different than them or that they are afraid of. They just won't do it. And so what this did was give me a different picture of my congregation and a better heart as a pastor. I think
one of the questions asks about your role as a black preacher in a predominantly white congregation, and what's specifically challenging about that role, and also why you'd want to be in that context.
Yeah, because God. My family is a heavy ministry led family. My mom's father was a well-known Baptist pastor in Oklahoma. He had 11 children. Most of his daughters married pastors, and if we were in our types of denominations, they themselves would be pastors, but could not be named that. I have 88 first and second cousins just on my mom's side, and I am the only one who pursued ministry. And It was not because I wanted to. I went to undergrad to do neuroscience, and I was happy as can be in it. And then more than halfway through, switched to feminist ethics and religious studies. And so I remember coming back home and explaining, changing my major and feeling called. But there was not a black pastor that would let me work with them. They just said, and this is, of course, backwoods Oklahoma, so going back, and it was just, you sit there on the pew and you watch me preach, hold my Bible, and we'll talk about it later. And so it was really working in all white churches that said, well, come on, we'll help you. We'll even give scholarships for you to go to school. And so then I started working in these churches, and I realized a big piece of my theology of a table set for all people, of women in ministry, of this theology. And I should also say my family also did not believe that you were to go to seminary or divinity school. So being able to have that education and going into that and knowing more and my eyes being open. I mean, I remember failing my first religious studies class because I thought it was going to be easy. So I was like, I'm at church 6 days a week. Obviously, I know everything about the Bible. And then I get in there, they're like, there's 2 creation stories. There's a few David and Goliath stories, and David didn't kill Goliath in one of them. And I'm like, what in the world? Nobody told me this stuff. And so really it formed into that. But I'm taking a long piece to get to the real reason. And so I remember it was 2011. I was with a friend who was already a pastor, and we were in the middle of Houston under a street light. It was 3 a.m. We had just left a bar hanging out and just, and he looked at me and he said, you realize that you do work in this reconciling process. And I said, no, I don't. I just preach to white people. What are you talking about? He said, no, this is your voice is helpful in telling a story that we often don't know, hear, or understand. And it was not too long after that I read Alan Bozak's Radical Theology. He was with Mandela in South Africa. And he said, in order for change to ever happen, we have to be in each other's faces and spaces. And until we do that, we will continue in our silos telling the same stories and doing the same things and never understand repair and reconciliation outside of that. Will always be a work that is done divided. And that was really a huge piece for me in saying, okay, this is something I love. This is something of who I am, and this is what I feel God is calling me to. But it's not easy. I mean, it's not easy when you have someone not at Wilshire. Again, Wilshire has been great, so I don't want anybody watching. I don't want y'all to think any different. But when someone stands up in a deacon's meeting and says, I would burn your house down, but I don't have any clean white sheets, right? Yeah, it's crazy that you would, these things that are, that happen and being called, right? Or sitting down with someone and just talking through and grabbing my Hebrew Bible and reading the Hebrew and saying, well, we'll start here, and then saying, well, it's not English, and I don't care how smart you think you are. The only thing I need is English, and it doesn't say it like that. All of these things of this push down, and it happens. And for a long time, my motto would be, not motto, but I would say to people when they would ask me to join things, and I'd say, there are many people who have asked me to come sit at the table, but have asked me to be silent. And I can't just sit at the table because you need just some more color on your board or in your church. Because the right to speak, the right to be, the right to live is what God has called us to do, and I can't keep silent. And so that is the part of the struggle, but also the call, the weirdness of it all. I'm still trying to figure it out day by day and hoping that somehow the Spirit of the living God continues to keep showing up.
It sounds as if in these communities, or at least in Emerywood specifically, it's a community that in some ways thought of itself as progressive on the forward end of things, and yet you found this conservative resistance within that. Can you talk about those? That wasn't surprising to me, having been in several congregations that are progressive.
Yeah.
I know that not everyone is progressive in a progressive congregation. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so I'll put it in some ways of Wilshire and Emerywood. A couple of weeks ago, I had someone who turned 91, and she had been at Wilshire since 1958, I believe. So she, 19, she joined Wilshire, and she said, for my entire adult life, I've been at this one church and only had 2 pastors until you came. So there was a 30-something year, and then 30-something year, and then me. And she said, so when people have kept saying, you know, what it means to be Baptist, and their only understanding of what it means to be Baptist is this place, it's not fairly, really true or honest, because the Baptist way is seen so many different ways. I mean, just 5 miles down the road, there is another Baptist church that I am not very happy with or pleased with, but that is 100% different than us, right? That we, but what I learned from Emerywood was most of those individuals, that was the only church they knew. And so part of that, they were like, this is just what it means to be Baptist. We're just doing that. It's not about being progressive or conservative or anything like that. This is just the only thing we know of how that is. And so one of the pieces of this, not just in the study, but for the whole church, is that we had to do a kind of year-long discussion around Baptist theology. And that changed a lot of their minds of like, oh, we didn't realize that those whole things, right? Now, most churches, let's just be honest, most Baptist churches, most Southern Baptist churches are not actually Baptist because they're not actually following the 4 freedoms of Baptist, but that's a whole nother time of this whole thing that goes against the Baptist faith and message. I don't have to talk about that. But yeah, so it's just fascinating the ways that churches look upon themselves by defining what they think is that denomination or that ethic or that creed, but do not know the history or background or knowledge of it. And so for a church like Emerywood, it wasn't that this is progressive or this is conservative. This is just all we knew.
Someone wrote a question saying that they've been in churches where preachers have denigrated the role of women, that have, said that lay people shouldn't be involved in the leadership of the church, et cetera. Are there good reasons to leave a church because you don't like what the preacher is saying?
Yes, 100%. That is not, please not. Yeah, that is 100% I do believe, yeah. An unsafe, unhealthy place you do not need to be in. I do not like using this line that so many people will use, but if it's not feeding your soul, right, then you should leave. But there's truth to dangerous churches out there. I've been lucky enough to be at a church where most of our new members are people who left dangerous theologies, dangerous churches, and to be able to be welcomed into a place and say, we just want you to be who God created you to be, no ifs, ands, or buts. Yes, there are reasons that you should leave a church and not be a part of that. That is not on this. And part of this is understanding relationship between congregant and pastor. But please don't hear me say, and please don't leave St. Bart's. St. Bart's is great. Don't do any of that. But yes, I definitely agree. Do
you have any advice for the discernment between healthy challenge and unhealthy challenge? When is it when is it good to be pushed by the preacher, and when is that dangerous or harmful?
Yeah. You know, it would have been really helpful if you would have gave me these questions. One red flag that I think is important, if you are doing deconstructing and those leaders in the congregation have told you that's not okay, that's part of that discernment of saying that this may not be the place that I can continue to flourish and evolve if they are halting me from gaining and learning more, even if it's different from what they believe and think. I'm a big person of prayer. The greatest theologian who I think is the greatest theologian, Abraham Joshua Heschel, says that prayer is the heartbeat of faith, and without prayer, we do not actually have God, because prayer puts us in the presence of God, and until we can ever understand God's essence, we have to be in God's presence. And so I think discernment is a huge piece of being in that presence and praying and understanding where God is moving and leading you. And I would say for churches like mine, we like to dictate a lot of how the Holy Spirit is moving. It's going to do this way with this song, with this prayer, and then we're going to...
Episcopalians have never been accused of this.
Well, I wasn't about to say it. I'm a guest, Peter. I can't... and so moving out the way, I'm hearing where God is leading and listening to that too. You know, for me, I will go back to when I shared my theology with family and friends, they shunned me. It wasn't until probably last year that most of my family saw me in a church because they disagreed with my theology. And part of the discernment for me in college was that I put a whiteboard up in my room and I said, I'm gonna write down everything I believe. And if I don't believe it the next day, it's okay, I'm just gonna erase it. But I'm gonna keep learning, I'm gonna keep figuring this out. And my mom would call every other day and say, I'm just so worried about your soul. And I said, I think this is what God wants me to do, to be able to figure out faith on my own and to understand this and not just to fall back on my grandpa and my grandma and others. So part of that discernment too, and that is that it may leave you by yourself sometimes. And that's okay. Yeah.
Well, we should stop in just a second, but I promised myself I wouldn't do this, but I'll fit one more question in. And I promise I didn't plant this. This was one of the ones given up for it. What advice do you have for those sitting in the pews as they listen to preaching happen?
Yeah.
To be more aware of both their unconscious and conscious biases.
Yeah. If something raises up within you, if you are finding yourself getting upset by something, or if you don't understand something, ask. Just go talk to those leading it, or it's really that simple. But we have put ourselves, in some ways, up on such a high pedestal that we fear that we can never question or ask or learn more, or to sit with, at times, with the preachers, pastors, rectors, all individuals. And so when we get that bristle, we just get up and we leave and we go somewhere else because it makes us feel comfortable. Have the uncomfortable conversations. Admit that I don't know everything and I just want to know a little bit more. Set the conversation up in a way that it is beneficial to you and leaders of the church. But if we are only just sitting for the sake of sitting every Sunday morning, what justice are we doing for ourselves and the community around us? Is that okay?
That's great.
Okay.
We'll leave it there. Tim, thank you so much.
Thank y'all for having me.
And thank you all for being here. You'll get to see Tim on a high pedestal in just a few minutes, so we hope you'll come next door or stay online and join us for our 11 a.m. service where Tim will be preaching. And we hope you'll be back for the forum next week as we welcome Van Newkirk II, senior editor of The Atlantic. See you then.